from the viewers. And of course, we'll probably stop and take breaks here and there if we need to. But please feel free to get up and move around if you need to. The restrooms are out the door here, around the corner, and on the left-hand side, and there's a code that you have to use, and the code is posted right there at the door. So please feel free to move around if you need to. I wanted to introduce, first of all, quickly, Rakesh Sharma in the back here. He's the analyst assigned to CalVIP, so he will be working closely with me on administering the grant going forward. And Dean from our IT department, thank you, Dean. And a few of our field representatives are here, Tim, and Ricardo, and Daryl, and they'll be helping out with the microphone as we move along. Here's our agenda. I'm going to give you a brief background on the grant and how it got to be CalVIP. I'm going to talk a minute about our executive steering committee process and their role in developing the grant. I'm going to run through the State Budget Act, which allocated the money for the CalVIP grant. And then we'll go and review the components of the RFP and what you need to do to put together a proposal, the proposal instructions, and then again, open it up to any questions at the end. So many of you in the room I know are familiar with the CalVIP grant program. That's the California Gang Reduction, Intervention, and Prevention Program. That grant was started in 2008, so it's been around quite a long time. Their annual allocations for that grant appeared in the state budget each year. The grant was focused on gang prevention, intervention, and suppression activities, and how to focus on a collaborative approach. We had just switched CalVIP over to a 3-year grant cycle with this last cycle, and we were gearing up to release the RFP for the next 3-year cycle when the January budget was released, and we learned that CalVIP did not appear in the budget. So we had to put a halt to our work, a halt to the RFP development, and we kind of went into waiting mode. Once the budget was released, we saw that there was the California Violence Intervention and Prevention Grant was in the budget. So the legislature worked to put the grant or reallocate money back into the budget for CalVIP. So there are a few things that are different. There are a few things that are the same and that look very similar to CalVIP, but there are a few things that are different. And we'll spend some time going over those today. So the first thing that's different obviously is the name. The legislature purposely took gang out of the name of the grant. And I don't want to speculate, but I believe it was to broaden the scope of the grant. So it's no longer necessary for applicants to focus on gang activity. If that's the problem in your community and if that's your need, that's fine. But it's violence, intervention, and prevention in general. So the focus on the gang is gone. Grants are now limited to $500,000 each, and those of you familiar with the grant with the CalVIP know that our last round of CalVIP, the grants were $1.5 million. So this is that's a big change as well. $500,000 is the cap. The eligibility to apply is now open to community-based organizations, and that's new as well. In prior iterations of the grant, only cities could apply. Cities were the lead applicants. Cities were required to pass through a certain percent of the grant funds to CBOs. That requirement remains for cities, and it's been increased from 20% to 50%. So the legislature increased that pass-through amount. The legislature also wrote in that the BSCC would give preference to cities or regions that are disproportionately affected by violence. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about how we came up with, we operationalized that preference and came up with a preference point system. And the legislature also wrote in that preference be given to applicants that propose programs that have been proven effective. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. The Executive Steering Committee, here at the Board of State and Community Corrections, we use an Executive Steering Committee process, we call them ESCs, for pretty much all of the work that we do. Whenever we are going to put out a new grant or develop regulations, et cetera, we pull together an Executive Steering Committee. So it's a process that we use often. The executive steering committees are made up of subject matter experts from around the state. So we try really hard to get a broad and diverse representation depending on the nature of the work. And we try to get people from the public sector, the private sector, CBOs, academics sometimes, and from North, Central, and South, Southern California, so that we are not sitting here in Sacramento making all the decisions around these grants. We really are bringing in people who are out in the field doing the work, and we guide them through a process of developing an RFP. So here for CalVIP, we had an executive steering committee put together, and I'll go over look at the membership in a minute. They met over a year ago in November of 2016, as I said, gearing up for the next round of the CalVIP grant. They went on hold when we learned that the grant had been eliminated, and then they reconvened this past September and helped finalize the RFP that you see before you. The members of the Executive Steering Committee are here on the screen. They're also listed on our website for those of you who are interested. These are the people who also will be scoring the proposals, so that's important to know as well. Obviously, you may know some of these people or you may know of them. Any of these members who have a conflict of interest when it comes time to score the proposals will of course recuse themselves from scoring certain proposals. Please do not contact these people. They have been instructed that they cannot give technical assistance because they were very close, obviously, to developing the RFP and they will be scoring the proposals. So they can't provide technical assistance. Another rule is all of the organizations represented on the Executive Steering Committee they're prohibited from receiving grant funds in any way as a direct grantee or as a sub-grantee. So they cannot receive funds. They could partner on a project potentially, because I have had that question come up, but they cannot receive funds. So any partnering they would do would have to be in an in-kind kind of relationship. Any questions about the Executive Steering Committee or their role?
Yeah, I do.
Yes.
When we talk about Sacramento County, we work with Sacramento County, but we're not, just when you said Sacramento County probation, does that mean all of Sacramento County?
No, it does not.
Okay.
And we look at these on a case-by-case basis, but it's specifically the probation department cannot receive CalVIP funds. They could continue to partner in an in-kind supportive role, not receiving funds. Does that make sense?
I'm more concerned about the scoring of the application.
Then Mr. Lozada would probably recuse himself if he, recognizes your organization and has worked with you before. He will say, I'm not going to read this proposal. And there are some conflicts of interest that we recognize as staff right away because they're apparent. So we try to recognize them up front, and then we ask ESC members to also let us know, and they have to sign a form, confidentiality agreement. So that's the process. Really great group of people. They worked really well together, and we had a really good mix of law enforcement and community service providers and people who were really familiar with what's going on. So I mentioned that the CalVIP grant appears in the State Budget Act. That's the authorizing legislation for CalVIP. CalGRIP was funded out of the restitution fund. CalVIP is funded out of the general fund. So that was another change. The legislature moved it over to the general fund. The State Budget Act stipulates that $1 million go to the City of Los Angeles in a non-competitive application, and that actually has been a part of this grant since day one. Because of the size of the City of Los Angeles, the legislature felt important that they have that money. So they still have to submit a proposal that meets all the requirements, but they are not competing for the money. The remaining $8.215 million is mandated to go out as a competitive grant. And that's the grant that you all have the RFP for, with a 100% match. 100% match, and that match, we'll talk about that in a minute, but that can be in kind or cash. But that, again, that's something that's stipulated in the State Budget Act. So these are some of the things that our Executive Steering Committee did not have any control over. These were mandates. Eligibility to apply. So the first thing I'll go through is eligibility. All California cities, any and all California cities in California are eligible to apply. As a part of their application, though, there is a mandatory 50% pass-through to one or more community-based organizations. So that's a mandatory part of their eligibility. And now the grant is also open to all California community-based organizations. So we talked about this on page 5. So you have to be a city or a CBO in order to apply. And I want to point out that as the term community-based organization was not defined in statute. So we have at BSCC have said that, or the executive steering committee looked at this issue. You do not have to be a registered 501c3. You do not have to have a registered 501c3 status. But any non-governmental community-based organization that wishes to apply have to meet certain criteria. And I'm going to go over those in a moment. But some other items related to eligibility, well, applicants may not submit more than one proposal. So we can't accept more than one proposal from a city or from a community-based organization. You are, though, as community-based organizations and cities for that matter, you're able to partner. You're able to apply directly and partner on another application if you so choose. You're free to partner with other governmental or non-governmental agencies, but note that there is no financial incentive associated to those kinds of partnerships, but you are free to partner with whomever and you like and however many agencies you like. That all applicants will have to adhere to the funding threshold, though, that we'll talk about in a minute. So in other words, you can partner with another city or another CBO, but that doesn't mean you get to apply for more than the $500,000. That $500,000 is the maximum funding amount per application. Any questions about eligibility? Yes.
A question came up in a conference call I was on recently on the flow through. So on the cities, it's understandable 50% goes to CBOs. If a CBO applies and wants to partner with a county, is there any type of restriction at all or any thresholds that CBOs have to meet with flow through, or can they have pretty much, they can do whatever they want, there's no restrictions at all?
There were no restrictions in the budget language regarding pass-through for CBOs. So CBOs have a little more flexibility there.
Thank you.
Yes. And I also want to mention for Los Angeles, though the city of Los Angeles has that $1 million non-competitive allocation, that does not impact CBOs that serve the city of Los Angeles. So CBOs in the city of Los Angeles are still free to apply. So these are the criteria for non-governmental organizations. So all CBOs who apply have to meet these criteria. And I'll just read through them quickly. All non-governmental organizations that receive CalVIP funds must be duly organized, in existence, and in good standing as of May 13th, 2017. That represents 6 months prior to the release of the RFP. Yes.
Yeah, we had one question that pertains to the last slide.
Oh, okay.
Do it now.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, it says here, we are a chartered center of a Cal State University, and we operate as a CBO. Are we eligible?
Yes, if you meet these criteria that are listed on the screen here, and they're listed on page 5 of the RFP. Be registered with the California Secretary of State's office if applicable, have a valid business license, employer identification number, and or taxpayer ID. Have any other state or local licenses or certifications necessary to provide the services requested. For instance, that would apply potentially to substance abuse treatment providers, et cetera. So providers who are required to have a certain license and have a physical address. These are not, you do not have to submit documentation with your application, but this is something that the BSCC would check for on a site visit. So we would, if your organization's awarded funds and we were to come out to do a site visit, we would check to make sure you're in compliance with these criteria, but you do not have to submit documentation with your application. So is everyone, any questions about that, about the criteria for the non-governmental organizations? The grant period will be 2 years, and it's an odd start and end date, and we realize that we're looking at a May 1, 2018 to April 30th of 2020. Because we got a little bit of a late start on the grant because of the stop and start, we have to encumber the money prior to June 30th. So we have to have a start date prior to June 30th. We want to give you the full and maximum amount of time that you can have to spend the money. The money will revert on June 30th of 2020. So this is the full 24 months. It allows then, it's going to be a very short liquidation period near the end. So we're going to be really working with everyone closely on invoicing, but it's a 2-year grant. You will be submitting one budget to cover the entire 2-year period. Any questions about the grant period? Proposals are due January 22nd of 2018. They must be physically received here in our office, not postmarked. We're asking you to submit one original copy with an original signature and one electronic copy that will be emailed to us, and those addresses are in the RFP. We ask that you also submit a notice of intent to apply. That really helps us with the planning of the scoring process. Since this is the first time it's been open to community-based organizations, we really have no idea of how many applications we're going to receive. So if you submit a notice of intent, that really helps us with the planning process. The notice of intent is non-binding, so if you submit a notice of intent and then decide you don't want to apply, there's no penalty. If you don't submit a notice of intent, you can still apply. It's not mandatory, but please, we would really appreciate it if everyone would do that. Any questions about the proposal due date? So eligible activities, the first question everyone usually has is, well, what can we do with this money? What are we allowed to do with this money? And I'm going to tell you that it's fairly wide open. The State Budget Act does not specify the types of activities to be funded. It does not say applicants shall use the money for X, Y, or Z. So the Executive Steering Committee wanted to leave that flexibility with the applicants, that and when we get to the proposal instructions, you'll see that the applicant will be describing their need and then proposing a program to address that need. So whatever your community's need is, you have that flexibility to describe it and to make a case for why you need this money. Applicants should select programs that best fit the needs identified by the community. So you'll see in the rating criteria that the Executive Steering Committee will be looking for that connection. So if you tell us, here's our problem, here's our need, and here's the data to back it up, your intervention or strategy that you propose should be directly connected to that. Preference will be given to applicants proposing to fund programs that have been shown to be effective at reducing violence. So as I mentioned earlier, this language comes from the Budget Act, but it was not defined. Proven effective was not defined. So the Executive Steering Committee chose to, again, leave some flexibility with the applicants. You will be making a case in your proposal for how the program you're choosing to implement, how is it proven effective? Based on what so you have some flexibility there in citing research studies, evaluations. Perhaps it was used in another jurisdiction and you have a copy of their evaluation, or you have some flexibility there in making a case for why you think this program is effective and will be effective in your community. Applicants may either implement new activities or programs or expand existing activities or programs. So let's say you have a program that's going along and it needs a little boost, or you think it would be really helpful to have this component. You can apply to augment that program. You can't apply to supplant. So we're always conscious of supplanting. You cannot use state grant funds to supplant existing activities, but expansion of existing activities is allowable. So other than that, the RFP outlines that the grant funds cannot be used for the acquisition of real property. That's really the only absolutely prohibited activity. Other than that, you are free to propose the activities that your communities need. Any questions there? Any questions online? As I mentioned earlier, there is a funding threshold of $500,000. This is for the entire grant period. It's not $500,000 per year. So $500,000 to be spread across 2 years. Applicants may apply for any amount up to the maximum. So I'll repeat, any amount up to the maximum. So it's important that you're realistic as you're preparing your proposals. Be realistic about what you think your organization can accomplish in 2 years. Be realistic about what you think your organization can spend in 2 years, and match in 2 years. I want to be clear about that. So you do not have to apply for the maximum amount, up to 500,000. Yes.
Do we get, and is there a scoring for, is there any problem with applying for the executive? Will we get dinged for it at all?
Oh, no, absolutely not. So your budget will be scored. It's one of the 4 rating factors. We'll go over that in a minute. And the executive steering committee will be looking for whether your budget makes sense in light of the program that you propose. So, if they're looking for that connection, you will not be, I've had a question before of whether the executive steering committee could say, well, they applied for 500, but they really only need 400. No, the executive steering committee is, no one is going to alter the amount of money that you proposed, that you requested. So, and there's no benefit to asking for a certain amount. It's just, it has to be based on what you need. The only time you may see a grant that comes in at a lower amount than what you requested is if your grant falls at the cutoff. So as the proposals are scored, we develop a ranked list, and we fund proposals until we run out of money. If your proposal's on that cutoff line, we have $150,000 left over, and you ask for 500, we'll contact you and say, do you want the 150,000? And if you say yes, then we'll ask you to revamp your proposal. So that's a process that comes, near the end, but your funding amount will not be altered as a part of the scoring process. And we have a question?
Yes, we have another online question here. Is this grant specific to youth or adult population? And also, is there an age range?
No, not specific to youth or to adults. So you're free, again, to develop a program that meets the needs of your community. So if you're open to work with either youth or adults, it's not specified, and there was no target age group specified either. So the funding distribution, this is something that the Executive Steering Committee developed. The Executive Steering Committee looked at the $8.215 million that's available for this competitive grant, and decided that they wanted to basically split it in half. So half of the money is allocated for cities, so $4,107,500, and half of the money is allocated to CBOs. So CBOs will be competing against CBOs, and cities will be competing against cities for that money. Should we not receive sufficient applications in any one category, we will move the money over to the other category. So we plan to allocate all of the money. But that's the funding distribution that's been set up. Any questions about the funding distribution? Okay. 100% match requirement. Again, this is written into the Budget Act, so we did not have any flexibility to change or alter this. All applicants must contribute a dollar-for-dollar match. That match can be cash or in kind or a combination of both. And when you see, when we go over the budget table, you'll see that we will ask you to line out your match. There's going to be a column for grant funds, there's going to be a column for cash match, and there's going to be a column for in-kind match. Cash match is defined as income from a source other than grant funds that is budgeted for the project, and that is budgeted for the project by the grantee. So personnel, staff time would be cash match. Facilities, supplies, things that the grantee is purchasing or expending funds on, that's defined as cash. In-kind match is non-cash outlay of materials or resources that support grant activities. So in-kind match could include contributions from your partner agencies, public and private partner agencies. So if your probation department says, we're gonna loan you a half-time probation officer, that's an in-kind match. If your local CDO says, we're gonna loan you a half-time caseworker, that's an in-kind match. If you are getting meeting space for free, if someone's donating their meeting space, we have a process by which you determine fair market value, and you can count that as match. If organizations are donating food for your meetings or supplies for your project, that's in-kind match. So there's lots of ways that you can meet that match. And we will work with you to make sure that you meet that match. The match is tracked. I want to be clear though, that the match is tracked in the same way that the grant funds are tracked. So be careful as you're proposing different types of match, make sure that you have a way of documenting it and of tracking it. So staff time has to be captured on timesheets, just like the grant funded staff's time would be. So the tracking and reporting requirements for match and for grant funds are essentially the same. Yes, question about match?
All right.
That's what we're here for.
Even though grant funds can't be used for purchase of real estate, can we use housing that we're providing to the clients as a match?
Absolutely, yes.
So do you track that by invoice? Is that how that happens? So it's about space use and facilities use. Is it, do you track that by, the owner sending that invoice over?
That's one way to do it. Also, I've seen grantees who have maybe called around to different meeting locations in their community and gotten some different quotes about what it would cost to rent the room. And then they, use those as their equivalents. So as long as you have some way of documenting it, tracking it, and in a way that would stand up to an audit, we accept it. There's not, what I'm trying to say is there's not one way to do it. There's different ways you can do it.
Got it. All right. It sounds like it doesn't have to be like an official type of invoice, but just some way to make sure that those numbers are documented somewhere.
Correct.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Yes. Oh, sorry.
Is there a restriction on the cash match being state dollars or any other type of dollars?
Good question. That is, I believe that's in the RFP. As long as the other source, grant source, doesn't prohibit it, it's okay. So other state grant funds, other federal grant funds, but just go back to the requirements that govern that particular grant to make sure it's not prohibited there. Yes.
Okay, we have another online question here. Specifically for city applicants, can the match be distributed between all partners, or does the city have to match the entire grant funds?
It's a great question. The match can be distributed among all partners, absolutely. It does not have to come from the grantee. So if you've got 5 partner agencies coming together to work on this grant, all 5 partner agencies can contribute. And really, your match contributions can come from anywhere and anyone. You just have to make sure they're documented and tracked appropriately. But that's a great question. And I will say that, and we'll cover this in a minute when we go to the budget, but it doesn't have to, you don't have, for every dollar requested, you don't have to request a corresponding match dollar. In other words, you could request that all your grant funds are in salaries and benefits, and your match could come from equipment. It doesn't have to line cross that way. But we'll talk about that in a minute. Reporting requirements tied to this grant, there are 4 main reports or requirements that we will look for. Number 1 is an evaluation plan. So about 3 months, I think it says 3 months in the contract after your grant is awarded, we'll be looking for you to submit an evaluation plan. And what this is typically a short document. There's guidelines that we provide to you, but you're going to explain to us how you plan to evaluate the outcomes of your program. And so we want to make sure that you have thought about how you are going to be collecting data and tracking outcomes. And we want to know that at the end of this 2 years, you're going to be able to assess whether this grant had the impact that you hoped it would have. Number 2 is quarterly progress reports. We require the BSCC quarterly progress reports, and what we have done is, what we typically do is we will work with you based on your proposal to come up with a progress report that is unique to your grant. There are some questions that will be standard across all grants, and then there are some that will be tailored to your unique proposal. And on the quarterly progress reports is really where you're reporting the quantitative data, how many were served, those kinds of numbers. Then we have our quarterly or monthly invoicing. So you'll be asked if once a grant is awarded, whether you want to invoice quarterly or monthly. You have an option there. It's a reimbursement grant, so funds are reimbursed after the fact. So you'll be submitting invoices for expenses that were incurred during the preceding reporting period, and then we issue a reimbursement check. You don't get the money up front. And then finally, a final evaluation report. At the conclusion of the grant, we'll be asking for a final evaluation report. What did you learn? What was the outcome? What were the outcomes? Did this grant have the impact you thought it would have or not? And if so, if not, why not? We have an obligation to report to the legislature at the conclusion of this 2-year grant, so we'll be really relying on your evaluation reports to help us report to the legislature. Any questions about reporting requirements? Audit requirements. All grantees are required to have an audit completed within 180 days following the completion of the grant period. The audit must cover the entire 2-year period. So what we don't want to make extra work for our grantees. So we will accept an audit report that you're already doing for the federal government. So if you're already doing a single audit, and this applies to organizations that receive $750,000 or more from the federal government, we will accept that single audit from CBOs and from cities. If you are not required to do that single audit, then we ask that you do a grant-specific audit, and you can use grant funds to pay for that audit. Any questions? I'm mentioning out-of-state travel because this has become more of an issue in the past couple of years, but out-of-state travel is restricted and only allowed in exceptional situations. As state employees, we have to get permission from the governor's office before we can travel out of state. So we have to put those restrictions on our grantees as well. So grantees must receive written BSCC approval prior to incurring expenses for out-of-state travel. I have seen out-of-state travel happen because oftentimes you're looking to implement an evidence-based program, and the only training they're offering is in Texas, and it's only offered once a year. You really have to have a compelling case, though, to travel out of state. You have to show us that there's just no way you can accomplish what you need to accomplish in the state. We'll ask for a justification and budget information, and this is even if it's in your proposal. Even if it's in your proposal and you're awarded, you still have to request separate written approval prior to traveling. And then additionally, I think something to consider is that the state of California prohibits travel to states that the Attorney General has declared have discriminatory laws. So there's a list of about 11, 12 states that we are prohibited from traveling to. And those can be found in Government Code Section 11139.8. So if you have any questions about that, please consult the RFP. All of this information is in the RFP. Any questions about that? No?
No.
I have one question on I did notice it in the RFP and I may have missed it. What are the RFP, but in the grant administration guide, what are the rules for BSCC as to indirect costs and for indirect costs either for the applicant or for the subrecipient, the grant partner?
Okay, so for indirect costs, we do ask that you refer to our grant administration guide, which is referenced throughout the RFP. It's available on our website. And at the end of the meeting, perhaps I can give everyone directions on how to get there. But there's restrictions on indirect costs. The Executive Steering Committee did not put any restrictions on indirect costs above and beyond what are already in our grant guide. We ask that indirect costs have to be based on either a cost allocation plan that your agency has already done, or you have let's say your cognizant or governing agency has approved you for a certain indirect cost rate, and you use that indirect cost rate whenever you enter into a contract, we'll be looking for documentation of that. So that's number one. It has to be based on a cost allocation plan or on an approved indirect cost rate from your cognizant agency. But in the grant guide, it specifies that indirect costs cannot exceed 10% of salaries and wages. So your salaries and benefits that you're requesting, it cannot exceed 10% of that, or 5% of the project costs, excluding equipment. So I will, after I post up the questions from today, I will make sure to post those explicit directions as well. So I'm gonna go through the RFP process, or what happens after you submit your proposal. So once your proposals come in, we at the BSCC, we do a technical compliance review. And what we'll do is just go through your proposals to make sure that all the appropriate material is there, that you have followed the guidelines for spacing and font size and page limits and all of that. If there are problems, or if we find non-substantive errors that can be corrected, we will be contacting you and giving you an opportunity to make some changes. We don't want to exclude any applications, based on just technical problems. Disqualification happens, there are two ways to be disqualified. Either you're not a city or a CBO, or you don't submit your proposal by 5 p.m. on January 22nd. We really hold fast to that proposal due date. So those are the only ways really that you can be disqualified. We will notify you once we receive your proposal. You'll receive an email from us saying your proposal's been received. You will not receive another email from us unless we find some compliance issues that need to be corrected. And then from there, your proposal goes to the rating process. So we'll be reconvening that executive steering committee that you saw up there. We provide them with a training on how to use our rating forms. We go over the RFP, we kind of bring them back up to speed, and then they score the proposals. So they'll have about a month or two to, depending on how many proposals we receive, to score those proposals. And then we'll bring them back together. They discuss their scores together, and they come up with funding recommendations. So that's what happens as a part of the scoring process. Once they've made their funding recommendations, they and I have a timeline here. Once they've made their funding recommendations, they will go to the board. So our BSCC board meets about 4 to 5 times a year. The meeting that will coincide with this process is April 19th. So that was another driving factor behind the funky start date on the grant. We have to get approval from the board April 19th, and then we're going to go ahead and get those grants out the door on May 1st. And then you should budget for a grantee orientation in late May or early June. We'll be convening all of the grantees here in Sacramento. And so you should plan for 4 to 5 of your staff or team partners to be coming to Sacramento. Any questions about the dates here?
Yeah, we have a question that pertains to the audit. So we have another online question here in regards to the single audit. Can the cost of the single audit requirement be included in our grant application?
So it's not the entire cost, because that would probably be supplanting, because as agencies, if you're already doing that single audit, you were doing it without the CalVIP grant. So what we could consider is that a portion of that single audit be paid for out of grant funds, and we would rely on you to come up with a formula for determining that, and we would probably want to talk to you ahead of time about approving that amount. But if you determined that the CalVIP represented 3% of your grant income, perhaps 3% of the cost of the audit could be charged to the grant. Does that make sense? Okay. So here are the rating factors. Your proposals will be scored on 4 factors. Does anyone need a break? you want to just keep going? Shall we take a 5-minute break? What do you? Go? Okay.
Yep.
I'll answer. I think we're gonna keep going, but I can answer, you know, if you need to step out, I can always talk to you afterwards. Your proposals will be scored on project need, project description, project evaluation, and budget. These are the 4 rating factors that were developed and decided on by the executive steering committee. And if you look at the percent of total value column, that's important. Those are the values, or those are the priorities that the executive steering committee assigned to each of those factors. So they felt like project need and project description were most important. Those will be worth 35% of your score. The evaluation is worth 15% and the budget is worth 15%. So think about that as you're developing your proposals. The raters will be using a point range of 0 to 12. So we want to make it easy on our raters. They're scoring from 0 to 12, but if you look in the point value column, the 0 to 12 will be multiplied depending on the percent of total value, and that comes up with our weighted score. So there are 160 points possible. Preference points. I mentioned earlier that the budget language mandates that we give preference to cities that are disproportionately affected by violence. So there is a list in the RFP of the cities that qualify for those preference points. There are 3 tiers of preference points, and we'll go over those in a minute, but they're worth 8 points, 5 points, and 2 points, which represents 5% of the total score, 3%, and 1% of the total score. So the total possible with preference points is 168. Any questions about points? And I forgot to introduce Ashley earlier. I have Ashley, raise your hand. Ashley's with our research team here at the BSCC, and she'll be crunching all the numbers when those scores come in from those raters. So, and she'll be training the raters on our rating process. Here's a sample scoring rubric. This is also in the RFP, but it essentially means our raters are scoring each of those 4 sections between 0 to 12. So you're getting an F, a D, a C, a B, or an A. We don't want our our scores have to do a lot of math, so we do the math on the back end. They assign a 0 to 12 based on that your entire submission for that factor, and then we calculate the weighted score. So preference points, there have been some questions coming in about the preference points, and what the executive steering committee used to determine the preference points was data that's submitted to the California Department of Justice by local law enforcement agencies averaged for 2015 and 2016. So we decided to look at 2 years, a 2-year sample, the 2 most recent years. There are 4 crimes that are classified as violent by the FBI and the Uniform Crime Reporting Program. And that's homicide, robbery, aggravated assault, and rape. The executive steering committee decided to look at homicide, robbery, and aggravated assault, and determined that we looked at crime rate. So we looked at rate of crime per 100,000 residents, and our research division came up with ranked lists. If a city that appeared in the top 5% for all 3 of those violent crimes will receive the 8 points. Cities that appear in the top 5% for 2 of the 3 crimes receive the 3 points, and the cities that appear in the top 5% for 1 then receive 2 points. You don't have to worry about the points. We will be assigning the points. Staff will be assigning the points based on the information that's provided in the application. So for cities, it's easy. Is the city applicant appear on that list? For CBOs, we're going to be looking at where you provide your services. So we'll get to the applicant information form in a minute, but you are to list the city or cities in which you provide service, in which you will be providing services for this grant, and then we will assign preference points as applicable. Any questions? Yes.
We're just got to quickly talk about situations. We're a CBO that provides transitional housing for youth coming out of incarceration and foster care. Our kids come from 34 counties. So we serve all of Northern California. We're here by SAC.
Okay.
So, where do our points come from? We certainly serve Sacramento region for sure. I mean, where do our points come
So,
from?
well, for this grant, I would assume you're gonna have to narrow down a target population or a target area.
Well, we have a target population. The target population are youth transitioning out of foster care or juvenile probation
Okay,
or juvenile incarceration.
okay. So I would say, I may have to talk to you after, but whichever city you're providing the services in, so where the transitional housing is located,
Right.
those are the cities that you want to list on your application.
All right, we'll talk.
I think we really have to go on a physical kind of address. Well, not necessarily a physical address, because we recognize a lot of CBOs provide services in cities and aren't necessarily located there.
Yeah.
And that was important to the executive steering committee. They wrestled with that issue. Do we go with physical address or do we go with where the services are provided? So it's where the services are provided. You will list the cities on the applicant information form. You can only earn preference points once. So even if you provide services in 5 cities that are on that list, we're gonna give you the highest points that you qualify for, but you can only earn those points once. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, so we're gonna get into the meat of it right now. This is the proposal instructions. What do you need to submit to us when your proposal packet comes in? There are 7 parts to the proposal. There's a cover sheet, there's a checklist, there's an applicant information form, there's a proposal narrative, a budget table, a budget narrative, and some attachments. These are covered on page 21 of the RFP. So the first thing is the cover sheet. I had someone ask me too, there are a lot of forms in the RFP, and do you need to recreate those forms? And unfortunately, the answer is, well, yes and no. What most applicants do is create a Word document and cut and paste the information into the Word document. You could also open up, we provided the RFP in a Word format, so you can open that up and fill it out right into the Word document and then just delete everything that is not a part of the proposal. So there's a couple ways that you can do it. But there's a cover sheet on page 22. Fill this out with the name of the applicants and the date of submission, and that should be on the very top of your proposal. Next, there's a checklist, and if everyone could, if you have the RFP in front of you, you can turn to page 23. This is a checklist for you to make sure that you have everything you need, but we also last year implemented a new process whereby we ask that your authorized official sign this checklist. So this is our way of ensuring that the person signing for the grant, is aware of what the requirements are and that all those requirements are there. So at the top, you'll see required items, cover sheet, checklist. The checklist has to be signed in blue ink by the official authorized to sign, applicant information form, narrative. So all the things I've just talked about right now. There are required attachments for all applicants, which is items 7 and 8. And then there are required attachments for city applicants only, which are 9 and 10. Optional is a governing board resolution. Cities will be required to submit a governing board resolution or documentation that the person signing for the grant has the authority to do so. So that does not have to come in with the application, it can come in later. These documents on this checklist are the only things that will be considered by the executive steering committee. So please don't send in newspaper articles and letters from your legislators, and we simply can't. We have to limit the amount of material that our readers are looking at. So don't send in anything other than what's on this checklist here. It will not be considered. There is the next part of the application is the applicant's information form. This is important. This is where all of your information is, who you are, how much money you're applying for. This is on page 25 and 26, and there are very explicit instructions on page 24 about how to fill this out. This must be filled out and signed again by your official authorized to sign. So on page 25 of the RFP, you'll see we're asking for the name of the applicant, and then Item C is CBO applicants. List a city or cities in which your organization will provide CalVIP grant-funded services. So that's where you CBOs will list the cities, and that's how we'll determine whether you qualify for the preference points. For city applicants, we'll determine it on your address. Project title, project summary. In item F, you list the amount of grant funds requested. Item G, we ask city applicants to list the amount of grant funds that they'll be passing through. And then you list your information for your project director, your finance officer, your day-to-day program contact, your day-to-day fiscal contact, and then the authorized signature. So there are restrictions about who those people can be. Those people have to be people that work for the grantee. So all of those people have to be people that work for the grantee. And those are the people that will be the authorized contacts on the grant going forward. So it's important that you try to identify those people for us now. Any questions about the applicant information form? So the proposal narrative, this is the meat of the proposal. Pages 27 to 30 cover the instructions and the guidelines. So the proposal narrative, you'll be creating a Word document using the headers that are provided, which are the rating factors: project need, project description, and project evaluation. So as you go through pages 27 to 30, you'll see that there are some bullet items that we're asking you to address in narrative form. So for each of those sections, address those bullets in narrative form. The restrictions at the top of page 27 are very important as well. We ask that all proposals come in Arial 12-point font, nothing smaller than 12-point font, with 1-inch margins on all 4 sides, and it can be spaced at 1.5. 1.5 line spacing is allowable, and it may not exceed 10 pages. So you've got to cover these 3 items in 10 pages. We do allow that you include a 1-page bibliography if you need to. It does not count for the 10 pages. And there are some guidelines here in the RFP. We ask them to use the MLA or the APA style for citations, and it really is just a bibliography. You cannot include additional information. The Executive Steering Committee can only score your proposal on what is submitted to them and contained in that proposal. So they're not going to be going to websites and visiting different websites or doing research. They're not allowed to do outside research. So that bibliography should just be a list of sources that were cited in your narrative. Any questions about the proposal narrative? So moving on to the budget table. The budget instructions are pages 31 through 33. We've provided a budget table for you on page 32. We ask that you, again, either fill this out here on the Word document and resave it, or cut it and paste it into another document. And let's see, I probably should have pulled the budget table up on the screen, but it's on page 32. So there are 8 budget categories that we use at the BSCC for our grants. We recognize they may be different than the ones you use, but we ask that you, for this grant, you use these 8. So that's number 1, salaries and benefits. Number 2, services and supplies. Number 3, professional services. Professional services would include contracts with consultants or with other public agencies. Number 4 is community-based organization subcontracts. So anything that counts as a community-based organization would go in that line. Number 5, indirect costs. Number 6, equipment and fixed assets. Equipment is defined as anything with a single unit value of $3,500. So if it doesn't meet that threshold, it needs to go in services and supplies. And that's outlined in our, actually it's outlined in the instructions here. Number 7 is project evaluation. And number 8 is other. So anything that doesn't fall into one of those 7 categories, including any training or travel or things of that nature, would go in the other category. There's 4 columns. A is where you list the grant funds. So the grant funds that you're requesting in each of those categories. And And again, column A cannot exceed $500,000. And then columns B and C is where you line out your match. So your cash and your in-kind match. And those two columns have to add up and equal to column A. So you have, if you're requesting $400,000, you have to come up with $400,000 in match. And it can be cash or in-kind or a combination of both. Some of you who are familiar with the SEC have probably seen in past grants that there's a mandatory minimum dollar amount that's required for evaluation. So in the past, we have required, or our ESCs have required that grantees dedicate 5% or 10% to their evaluation efforts. There is no such requirement on this grant. You are required to do an evaluation, to submit an evaluation at the end of the project, but it's up to you as to how much you spend on that evaluation and how, we really wanted to give you the option of using that as your match or, partnering with a public university. So you have some options there. The evaluation is a requirement, and we ask that you line out the money that you're spending on your evaluation, but there is no minimum. Please report your dollars in whole numbers only and check your math. Any other questions about the budget table? Okay, so now we'll go to budget narrative. For the budget narrative, there is a page limit of 3 pages. So this is on top of your 10-page proposal narrative. You have the 1-page bibliography, you have the budget table, and now you have an additional 3 pages for your budget narrative. So in your budget narrative, what you're doing is providing some detail for the readers, for the SEC, to support the numbers that you listed in your budget table. So for salaries and benefits, list out the staff positions, list out the amount of time they'll be working on the grant, their salary or hourly rate. Provide as much detail as you can in those 3 pages, because the readers are really going to look to that to determine whether your budget truly does support your project activities. Same restrictions on the budget narrative: 12-point font Arial, 1-inch margins, and 1.5 line spacing. So pay close attention to the instructions that start on page 34 through 36. And you notice at the end of each of the rating criteria, at the end of the 3 sections in the proposal narrative and at the end of the budget narrative, there's a table that says rating criteria. Those are the rating criteria that the ESC members will be scoring you on. So really, it's really important. They match the bulleted items in all cases above. So as you're writing your proposal narrative, you're addressing these criteria, but just pay close attention. That's how you'll be scored. Any questions about the budget table or the budget narrative? Attachments. First of all, I noticed an error in the RFP. There are 2 attachment H. And we're close to being finished, so otherwise I would give you all a break, but I think we can power through. So the last section, the last part of your proposal are the attachments. All applicants are required to submit attachment G, which is on page 64 of your RFP. And this is your, I didn't talk about this yet, but this is a certification of compliance with our policies regarding debarment, fraud, theft, and embezzlement. So this is new to our grants, but we ask that your official authorized to sign also sign this. This is certifying that neither the applicant nor any of the proposed sub-recipients have been debarred by the federal, state, or local government, or convicted of fraud, theft, or embezzlement by the federal, state, or local government. So pay special attention to attachment G, that has to be signed. Attachment I is on page 74. This is the work plan. This is the one that's incorrectly labeled as attachment H. So attachment I, CalVIP work plan, it's a 1-page what we ask you to do here is sort of give us a one-page snapshot of your project. What are your goals and objectives and your activities, your responsible staff, and your timeline? So that gives us a one-page snapshot. It's really helpful for when we're going out to do our compliance visits. It's really helpful when we get requests from the field. It's kind of a cheat sheet for your project. City applicants, and this is again based on the budget language, are required to submit attachment B and C. Attachment B is your coordinating and advisory council, and I haven't really talked about that yet. This is a holdover from the CalVIP grant, but every city that applies is required to convene a coordinating and advisory council to prioritize the use of the grant funds. So we're looking for attachment B. I don't think I might be using it there. Attachment B, if you could turn to page 39 for cities. The Budget Act states that each city that receives a grant shall collaborate and coordinate with area jurisdictions and agencies, including the existing County Juvenile Justice Coordination Council, with the goal of reducing violence in the city and adjacent areas. So we are asking, this is not a scorable item, but we're asking that you fill this out, explain how your city will fulfill this obligation if selected for CalVIP funding, and it's again signed by the authorized official. So that addresses your mandate to collaborate and coordinate. And then it's attachment C that contains your membership of your coordinating and advisory council. And so what we ask is that you list the members of the committee, their title, the organization they're from, their email address, and their signature. So their signature on this form is our assurance that they participated on that committee in helping to prioritize the use of the funds. No other attachments are allowed.
We got one question.
Yes.
It says, what is attachment H?
So attachment H, the first attachment H, because unfortunately the attachment I got mislabeled. Attachment H is a sample of our comprehensive monitoring visit tool. So I'm glad you brought that up. We put this in the RFP so that you can see as a grantee what are the items we'll be checking on when we come out to do our comprehensive monitoring visit. So that gives you a little heads up for planning purposes. Attachment D is a sample contract. So it's also helpful for you to read through that. It talks about, it's attachment E. It's a sample contract. So if you are awarded grant funds, we will be entering into contract with you, and this is what the contract looks like. So it's got our general terms and conditions and special terms and conditions. A lot of what I talked about today in terms of the reporting requirements, the audit requirements, those are all outlined in that contract document. Any other questions about attachments? Yes.
But we're now calling attachment I.
Yes.
Is that part of the review process?
It is not. It is not, but it is a required attachment. So I think yes.
Quick question. If you're not a city or CBO, but you have formed an advisory group for your project, should you fill out that form?
That's a good question. No. It won't be scored. It's not a part of the scoring process. So it's yeah. I think it's something you want to maintain locally, and it would be a part, really valuable part of your overall evaluation and kind of implementation process, but it's not part of the scoring.
So maybe just mentioned in the narrative?
Yes. So what I'd like to do next is go through all of the frequently asked questions. So why don't we take a 10-minute break and reconvene in here at 11:20? How does that
We have a hybrid going on, so she got
Yes.
the
So, there, there, it'll come up, there you go.
Yeah, I need you to help me. For some reason, I couldn't get it to go back up there in the view that I had. I mean, there's nothing really up there. I had a couple more questions during the break, and I want to discuss them with the group because I think they apply to everyone. I had a question about the procurement process that you're required to use. So with public agencies, we require you to use your own local procurement process. There are some guidelines in our grant guide that we ask you to follow. For instance, non-competitive bids, we ask that you submit, that you get prior approval from us. What that means is that prior to entering into contract, you provide us with all of the information that you use to determine the non-competitive bid. And I just had it. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna follow up with our council to get really clear instructions for CDOs and for what your requirements are. There are requirements listed in our grant guide about when you have to do a formal advertising process and a formal bid process and an RFP. But we do allow for non-competitive bids. So we just ask that you document it. So, but I wanna be clear on what the requirements are for CDOs. And I'm gonna have to get back to you on that one. And I will, when I publish this, I'm gonna definitely contain the citation from include the citation from our grant guide, so you have that. Another question that came up was, what if we want to dedicate more than 100% of our match? What if we're gonna have additional funds or additional match on top of that? And my answer was, we ask that you not include that in your budget, because first of all, there's no benefit to you, for you in this process. You don't get extra points or anything like that. And then in the end, what happens is, typically, I mean, it's common that as a grant progresses, things sometimes don't pan out the way you thought they did. And you run into a crunch in meeting your match. Well, now you not only have to meet 100%, you have to meet 110%. Because once it's in your budget and approved, we can't change it. So we recommend that you only include that 100%. If, however, locally, your local partners are contributing above and beyond that 100%, by all means, include it in your progress reports, include it in your evaluation report, because it's an important part of your story and it's an important part of sustainability going forward. But we just ask that you not include it in your budget and not report on it on the invoices. So did everyone get, I'm gonna go through now as our frequently asked questions, or the questions that have come in so far. These questions are posted on our website, and then I have some handouts up here, and I wanna read through them with you. The first question I've already covered: will the grant be awarded at $500,000 per year or spread across the 2 years? And I've said it will be spread across the 2 years. Will number two, applicants be required to submit budgets with an equal amount of spending for each of the 2 years? That's a good question. No, you will not. You will submit one budget that covers the entire 24-month period. So you don't have to split the dollars equally between the 2 years. You are free to spend or allocate and spend those dollars as meets your needs. Number three, who are the eligible applicants? So we covered that already. District Attorney's Office or local law enforcement task forces. As long as the city or the CBO is the applicant, there's no restriction on who you can partner with. So district attorney's offices or other county organizations are free to partner, but the applicant has to be a city or CBO. Can an individual nonprofit organization apply for this grant? Yes, we covered all the criteria for non-governmental agencies. Number five, cities are required to pass through 50%. That's a minimum amount. You're free to pass through more than that if you choose, but 50% is the minimum. Number six, are grant applicants allowed to work together under one application? Can multiple CBOs or cities work together? There is nothing that prohibits multiple cities or CBOs from working together within one application, but the maximum amount per grant is $500,000. So you can't combine grant amounts, and there's no incentive on the scoring process either. Is it possible for a city and a CBO from the same city to be awarded separately? That's a great question. Yes, cities and CBOs apply individually and they'll be considered individually. There are no restrictions on the number of cities within a county that apply. There are no restrictions on the number of CBOs within a city or county that apply. I mean, it's just, the only restriction is one application per applicant. Number 8 are letters of intent mandatory. And as I said earlier, they're not mandatory, but strongly encouraged. Number 9, although the proposal does not require memoranda of understanding or letters of agreement, will these documents be accepted and considered within the application? Those documents will not be accepted or considered as a part of the scoring process. That's something that you would maintain locally as a part of your implementation. Number 10, would simulators that provide video-based scenarios to train staff on how to de-escalate situations be considered eligible items? And the answer is yes, these would be eligible items. Number 11, may CalGRIP funding be used to enhance our computer crimes lab by funding construction within the police building, equipment costs, or training? And the answer there also is yes. So most any activity is eligible for funding, as I outlined earlier, but there has to be a direct connection to the need that you describe and the need that you describe in the project that you're implementing. What are some examples of in-kind matching funds? We went over that, number 12. Number 13, are grant funds provided in advance to grantees, or will grantees need to submit invoices? As I said earlier, grant funds are not provided in advance. Grant funds are reimbursed or dispersed on a reimbursement basis after expenditures have already been incurred. Number 14, are Los Angeles-based CBOs restricted from applying in the CBO category? And the answer to that was no. Any and all CBOs from the city of Los Angeles are eligible to apply and are not included in the $1 million allocation. Our city is not, number 15, our city is not listed for potential preference points. Does BSCC expect to fund projects outside of those receiving preference points? And the answer is we cannot anticipate the results of the scoring of proposals. However, the Executive Steering Committee designed that preference point system so that those cities that are disproportionately impacted would receive a slight advantage, but the expectation is not that it guarantees an award. As I mentioned earlier, it's just a slight bump in the points. So we don't expect that it's an automatic guarantee of funding. We encourage everyone to apply. The Executive Steering Committee has placed a much higher value on those 4 rating factors we went over: need, project description, evaluation, and budget. And number 16 is a similar question. Our city has a much smaller population. Our crime ratio per 10,000 population is very high. Would this be a consideration? And will similar jurisdictions or smaller jurisdictions be competitive? And our answer was actually 24 of the 101 cities that qualified for preference points had populations of less than 20,000. So very small cities are absolutely competitive. And because we use the crime rate rather than raw crime numbers, a lot of those small cities came up. And what I would encourage applicants who don't qualify for the preference points, you're free to use the need section in your proposal to make your case to describe your violence, to use your local data to describe your violence. The Executive Steering Committee was really clear that those preference points are just that. They're preference points, but they don't take the place of your description of the project need and your description of and all the data that drives that need. Our members, number 17, members of the CalVIP Coordinating and Advisory Council prohibited from receiving CalVIP funds. So for those cities that are convening those coordinating and advisory councils, are members of that committee prohibited? And our answer is that applicants should consider state and local conflict of interest laws when selecting those members. And we really advise you to consult with your city attorney on what your local conflict of interest rules are. And those are all the questions that have come in so far. Are there any remaining questions? Yes. I'll go to you.
In the, you talked about the scoring process and sort of how that would work. Could you just sort of talk about a little more sort of, you sort of said that everyone would be scored and then you sort of work your way down to the one out. I was confused by that.
Sure, so our, the members of the steering committee, score the proposals individually, so they each take them and score them using the scoring rubric, and we provide them with forms, and we provide them with training. They assign a score to each proposal, and then we, as our research division, does the math that's necessary to compute the weighted scores, and then we will add on the preference points. And then each city, or each applicant, I'm sorry, will come out with a final score. We will rank those from highest to lowest. And then when we go to make our recommendation for funding, we will start at the highest. And so let's say, and we'll just go down the ranked list until that $4.1 million is exhausted.
Will it matter to say the top 5 are all from Los Angeles?
No, it does not. Each proposal is considered individually. So no, it doesn't matter. It's just gonna fall where it falls. So we always hope to have a spread across the state, but that's not taken into consideration. It's solely based on the application score. Rakesh?
Yeah, so we have a few more that came in. The first one that we have is, can a CBO apply to provide services in more than one city?
Yes.
And then we have, can you give an example of the preferred type/level of evidence needed to make the case that a program is proven to reduce violence?
Actually, I want to go back to the first question. Yes, a CBO can apply to provide services in more than one city, but a single CBO can only submit one application. So the provision of services to multiple cities would have to fall within that one application. For the other question, I want to turn back to the RFP. And I want to go to the proposal narrative section, which is, I want to look at page 29. So under the project description section, this is where you're going to be addressing that question. So first, you're going to list and describe the programs to be implemented. And the second bullet, cite the evidence or data that has shown the program is of the type to be the most effective at reducing violence of programs available. That is some legalese. But you really the onus is on you as the applicant to convince the people who are scoring this proposal that you've done some homework, that you've chosen a certain program or a certain strategy. You believe it's going to work on your population, and you must have a reason for believing it's going to work. And what are those reasons? You've seen it work in a neighboring jurisdiction. You've cited evaluation reports. Perhaps the program appears on a list of evidence-based programs maintained, by a university or other organization, or perhaps it's listed as a promising program by the Department of Justice. So you really have some flexibility there in making a case for why you think that program is considered effective or will be effective with your population.
Okay, thank you. And we have one more, and then there's a follow-up that comes behind that. So would IRB approval be needed for local evaluation of a program working with low-income youth who might be considered a vulnerable population?
Who might be considered what?
A vulnerable population?
Okay, so they're talking about, we don't have any, the BSCC does not have any specific evaluation requirements around that. So I would say working with their local evaluator, just determine that locally. So it was IRB?
Yeah, IRB, I'm trying to.
I know, are there any researchers in the room? Yes, it's escaping me.
It's just the
Confidentiality.
university's way of assuring that you have all your checks and balances when you're touching individuals or just doing research. So it's the university's checks and balances, international right review.
Okay.
For protection of human subjects.
Okay. So we don't have those. We don't put those restrictions on the evaluation. So I would say if they're partnering with the university, or if they should follow whatever their evaluators, protocols are.
Okay, and then the person also wrote thereafter, similarly, would state IRB approval be required if state funds are used?
No.
Thank you.
And, going back to the other question on the use of effective programs, I also want to point people to page 9 of the RFP, because in page 9 of the RFP is where we sort of discuss the background of, or what we consider to be sort of evidence-based principles here at BSCC and what goes into that. And so that gives you a little more information from which you can develop your proposal. But we talk here about, is there evidence or data to suggest that the program is likely to work? For example, was the program you selected used by another jurisdiction with documented positive results? Is there published research on the program you are choosing to implement showing its effectiveness? Is the program being used by another jurisdiction with a similar problem and a similar target population? So again, it's really, you really have some flexibility there in making your case. Are there, yes?
One more question, sir. Is there some sort of strategy document, need assessment, or plan, like a master plan related to this program or its predecessor?
No. Short answer.
Sometimes there is.
This is, again, if you went back and looked at the Budget Act each year, you could see the authorizing language for CalGRIP, which was a little more extensive than CalVIP, but again, not a lot of, there are no regulations around this grant. It's a pretty broad, flexible grant. Yes?
When they score everything, is there a way that we can get our scores and any feedback so we know how well we did or did not do?
That's a great question. Once the proposals are scored, yes, we'll be notifying applicants of the results prior to the board meeting so that those applicants that are recommended for funding will know. And then if you request feedback from us, our research division usually prepares a spreadsheet showing where your scores fall in those different categories related to the other applicants. So they'll show kind of where was the mean, or what was the average and where did you fall? What was the high, low, average? And where did you fall? And then if you can request individual feedback, not from the ESC members, but from staff, and then we try our best to, provide you, we can't provide the exact feedback. The ESC members are not going to provide written feedback, but we can provide our feedback based on a review of your proposal and looking at the scores, and so we can provide technical assistance, yes. Yes.
Our meetings are open as well, so.
That's true. So all of the executive steering committee meetings are open to the public. So that once the proposal process, once they've scored all the proposals, they will convene together, and that will be their chance to sort of, our research team will have analyzed all the scores and looked for outliers, extreme outliers. So let's say, there was a proposal where one ESC member gave it a 12 and one gave it a 1. We're going to want to look into that a little deeper. And so at that meeting, they have a chance to kind of discuss, make sure nobody missed anything. And that meeting happens, at the end of the process, and it is open. So you can always attend that meeting as well. Yes.
Go ahead.
So there's a part of the project description around describing agency roles and responsibilities, but I didn't see anything about agency capacity or capacity to manage state funds or history. None of that.
The executive steering committee chose to keep this RFP simple, and for lack of a better word, they really did. They want to know. They chose not to include that this time. I have seen that in other of our RFPs, but it's not there this time.
Okay, so we have 3 more that came in. Will CBO applicants be competing with both city applicants and CBO applicants, or will these pools of applicants be scored separately?
So our plan is, as you saw, the $8 million is split into two pots of money. And so once the scores are tabulated, we're gonna have a ranked list of CBOs and a ranked list of cities. So they are not competing for the same funds. We will exhaust the $4 million on the CBO side and then again on the city side. So the short answer is no. Everyone's responding to the same RFP, but not competing for the same pot of money. Hopefully that makes sense.
Regarding the match funds, if we are applying for grant funds to expand an existing program, can we use the existing programmatic funding as a match?
Yes.
Follow-up questions regarding match. Is there a stipulation that match funds must be for the same services in the same city or just the same services in the same region?
The match, there has to be a direct correlation between the match and the grant-funded activities. So even in the first scenario where it's an existing program and they're augmenting it, I said yes, that is the short answer. You could use the existing program as match, as long as you can make a case that whatever those existing services are, they are connected to what you're doing with the grant funds, that you're serving the same population, you're providing expanded services to that population, you're serving their families. There has to be a connection. So whatever that connection is, it's the same community, it's the participants that are receiving grant-funded services are also going over to a partner agency and receiving services over there. There's no black and white answer to that question, but as a grantee, you have to be able to show that the match, any match activities are directly related to what you're doing with those grant activities. Yeah, that's the best. Okay. Does everyone feel like they have what they need to submit a proposal? Okay, great. If there are no more questions, then we are finished here. So thank you all for coming. And if there are additional questions, I'll just say if something comes up after this, I'm going to be taking questions up until January 8th. I will post the final FAQ on January 12th. And any additional questions should go to our email address, which is calvip@bscc.ca.gov. And I will post the questions and answers that came up at today's meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Rakesh. Maylee, good to see you. I've been okay. How have you been? I saw you took some time off to be with your baby. Awesome. Good for you. Oh, I'm sorry.
Quickly.